Times Square in the 1970s and 80s was not the family-friendly destination it is remembered as today. It was the symbol of New York's decline, a place where sex, drugs, and violence ruled the streets. Adult theaters and peep shows lined 42nd Street, their neon lights masking the desperation underneath. Prostitution, hustlers, and drug deals turned the crossroads of the world into a marketplace of survival. The police presence was thin, and corruption made safety a fragile illusion. To step into Times Square before Disney was to enter a world of danger, chaos, and unforgettable grit. Times Square in the 1970s bore little resemblance to the polished attraction known today. Neon lights still flashed across 42nd Street, but the messages they carried were no longer Broadway glamour. Marquees promoted adult films, peep shows, and live acts that catered to desperation rather than entertainment. Theaters that once premiered Hollywood blockbusters had been converted into pornography houses, their lobbies covered in smoke and litter. Outside, peep show booths and adult bookstores competed for attention, their entrances guarded by neon arrows. The spectacle drew crowds, but not the families that once filled the district. The decline reflected broader problems in the city. As manufacturing jobs disappeared and crime rose, Times Square became a visible stage for decay. Shops struggled to survive, while new businesses that thrived on vice found easy profit. The heart of Manhattan pulsed with a rhythm of decline. Even amid the chaos, the lights never went out. Tourists still came, some out of thrill-seeking curiosity, others by accident. Locals avoided it unless necessity called. The contrast between the square's bright glow and its dark reality defined the era. By the late 1970s, Times Square had become a symbol of fear across New York. Newspapers described 42nd Street as dangerous, and its reputation reached far beyond the city. What had once been called the crossroads of the world was now seen as its gutter. Crimes rose sharply, with muggings and assaults common. Drug dealers and pimps controlled much of the activity, often unchecked by law enforcement. Violence was not hidden, it unfolded in plain sight under neon lights. For residents of the city, walking through Times Square meant risk. Office workers hurried through during the day, but avoided it at night. Families no longer brought children near the theaters or arcades. The space belonged to those who thrived in its shadows. The city's decline was embodied in those blocks. Times Square became shorthand for everything that was wrong with New York poverty, corruption, crime, and neglect. It stood as the darkest chapter of Manhattan's mid-century story. Prostitution and drug use dominated the sidewalks of Times Square. Women and men, many driven by poverty or addiction, offered their bodies for survival. Street corners became markets of desperation, overseen by pimps who controlled territory with violence. Heroin and cocaine were openly exchanged, with dealers treating the district like an outdoor pharmacy. Addicts wandered the streets in search of their next escape, their presence a constant reminder of the cycle of decay. The district's rhythm was measured in transactions, not entertainment. Police patrols were sporadic, and corruption often meant selective enforcement. Some officers took bribes to ignore businesses, while others simply stayed away. The lack of consistent law made vice an accepted reality. For many trapped in this world, Times Square was both cage and lifeline. Survival meant enduring exploitation, addiction, and constant danger. The crossroads of the world had become a crossroads of despair. The atmosphere of Times Square was thick with tension. After dark, muggings, stabbings, and shootings echoed through the avenues, leaving residents and visitors on edge. Fear became as much a part of the landscape as neon. Gangs carved up territory, often clashing over drug deals or control of prostitution. Innocent bystanders could be caught in sudden eruptions of violence. Newspapers filled with reports that painted the square as a lawless zone. Business owners lived under constant threat, paying protection money to survive. Some closed their doors, leaving empty storefronts that added to the sense of abandonment. The economy of fear extended from sidewalks to back rooms. Despite its reputation, life did not stop. Theaters remained open, vendors still sold food, and taxis still picked up passengers. Yet every transaction took place under the shadow of potential danger. The square belonged to violence more than to commerce. By the early 1990s, Times Square had reached a breaking point. Its image as the epicenter of crime and vice was cemented, and calls for reform grew louder. Politicians began to see the square not as culture, but as liability. Large redevelopment plans were drafted, aiming to attract investors and corporate interests. Police crackdowns increased, and adult theaters faced closures one after another. The district's identity of grit and desperation was being erased step by step. For many locals, the transformation felt like the end of authenticity. The chaos, while dangerous, had been uniquely New York. Corporate logos and tourist attractions could not replicate the raw energy of the past. The character of the square shifted from survival to spectacle. As Disney and other companies moved in, the Times Square of the 1970s and 80s disappeared. What had once been infamous for vice became a global family destination. The end of an era came quickly, but its memory remains vivid. By the mid-1970s, Times Square no longer represented the glamorous heart of New York, but a symbol of urban decline. Storefronts stood vacant, once grand theaters crumbled, and neon lights flickered above sidewalks littered with trash and debris. The crossroads of the world looked more like a stage of abandonment than of spectacle. The economic crisis of the decade deepened this decay. As industries closed and jobs vanished, poverty spilled into the streets, leaving entire blocks marked by neglect. Homeless men and women filled subway entrances, while shopkeepers locked their doors earlier each night. What once attracted families and tourists became a destination only for the desperate. The decline was not just physical but deeply social. Families stopped visiting the area, long-standing businesses collapsed, and civic pride seemed to vanish. Politicians and newspapers used Times Square as shorthand for the collapse of the entire city. The square's condition mirrored the despair that gripped New York as a whole. Even in its broken state, a certain vitality refused to die. Street vendors sold food, buskers performed music, and hustlers ran games, carving out a living among the ruins. Decay did not erase energy, it only changed its face into something rawer and harder. Every corner of Times Square bore witness to crime. Robberies, muggings, and assaults were daily occurrences, while prostitution and drug sales operated in the open. Police patrols were thin, and fear spread through residents and visitors alike. Vice became the district's dominant economy, thriving where official structures had failed. Desperation was etched in the faces of those trapped by poverty and addiction. Women and men worked the streets for survival, while addicts staggered in search of their next fix. Dealers conducted business openly, their presence tolerated by authorities too overstretched to intervene. The human cost of the square's decline was inescapable and devastating. Law enforcement struggled to contain the spread of crime. Corruption, underfunding, and lack of coordination left residents convinced that justice was a commodity for sale. Some officers ignored obvious offenses in exchange for cash, while others simply stayed away. The police were visible, but trust in authority was absent. This dangerous blend of crime and desperation gave Times Square its infamous reputation worldwide. Beneath the bright neon lights, survival was the only rule, written into every corner and alley. The district became a cautionary tale of how quickly a city could unravel. Before the corporate makeover, Times Square was a world of grit that defined an entire era. Theaters were shabby, sidewalks cracked, and neon signs lit up spaces filled with hustlers and dealers. It was New York, stripped of polish, a raw portrait of survival. Amid the chaos lived a strange form of authenticity. Artists, musicians, and underground performers drew inspiration from the square's unruly energy, creating subcultures that flourished on its margins. Punk, graffiti, and independent theater all found roots here. What frightened outsiders often gave insiders a sense of belonging. The grit came from those who refused to leave. Vendors sold food from carts, hustlers ran games of chance, and survival itself became a performance for anyone passing by. Every transaction, legal or not, added to the rhythm of the district. Life continued, though it was lived in shadows and under constant threat. This rough identity stood in sharp contrast to the family-friendly theme park image that followed. For better or worse, the grit gave Times Square a personality that no corporate brand could replace. It was ugly, dangerous, but deeply real, an identity burned into memory. What truth hides beneath polished facades today? 42nd Street, once the crown jewel of Broadway, had by the 1980s become its most infamous stretch. Theaters that had premiered Hollywood classics now displayed pornographic titles on fading marquees. The street's collapse told the story of cultural decline in real time. Walking down the block meant navigating panhandlers, hustlers, and drug dealers, all competing for survival. Shopfronts sold everything from cheap electronics to illicit material, often under questionable legality. The vibrancy of the street was gone, replaced by shadows of exploitation. The physical decay matched the moral panic it inspired. Broken lights, boarded-up windows, and graffiti left the street in perpetual twilight, giving the impression of a place abandoned by authority. 42nd Street became a symbol of what New York most wanted to deny. Yet for those who lived its reality, it was more than a cautionary tale, it was home and workplace. Hustlers, vendors, and sex workers forged their existence among the ruins, turning survival into routine. The ruins were filled not only with decay, but with untold stories of endurance. From the early 70s through the 80s, Times Square became synonymous with urban danger. Tourists were warned away, while locals hurried through during the day and avoided it entirely at night. Fear clung to the district as tightly as the glow of its neon lights. Vice ruled without apology. Drugs, sex work, and scams formed an underground economy stronger than any official authority. Dealers operated openly, pimps enforced brutal control, and hustlers drained pockets through tricks and games. The years of fear were also years of profit for those who thrived in shadows. The media amplified this reputation, with headlines and films portraying the seedy truth. From gritty cinema to nightly news, Times Square became the stage on which New York's struggles were projected. The square was not exaggerated. In fiction, it was lived daily by thousands. By the time reforms arrived, the scars of these years were deep. The underground economy had shaped lives, destroyed families, and altered the identity of an entire district. The years of fear and vice remain etched into New York's memory as one of its darkest chapters. Times Square of the 1970s and 80s was more than a district, it was the reflection of a city in crisis. Sex, drugs, crime, and desperation shaped its rhythm, creating a place feared by many, but lived by thousands. The neon lights masked broken dreams, and every block carried stories of survival and loss. Remembering this era is not about nostalgia for danger, but about understanding how deeply the city transformed. To preserve these memories and keep history alive, subscribe and join us in revisiting the forgotten struggles that shaped New York.